Edmund, the Queen. Edmund wasn't certain on how to feel once dawn awoke him. The only sensation he was capable of enduring in the first few moments was the ache, one that pulsed through his head that continued to suffer from the rum and wine he had the night before. The Queen's foreign beverage had worked its sick magic, swelling his brow and turning his tongue to ash. Next came the burn in his throat that pleaded for something to ease the scorch it was plagued with. He used the morning to think on what a disaster the gathering had become. He thought of the many young women who were there to seek his attention, though he couldn't care less about the opinions they had of him and his actions. With any luck, they would each be begging their fathers to raise the sails on their ships, to take them away from Braille's shore so that they might never return to the Trident Islands again. Ollie claimed his mind for the most part, reminding him of how he was still in Braille, down at the docks, at an arm's length from his father's clutches, instead of being across the sea like Edmund had wished. His drunken haze made the night break into confusing flashes, but the sight of Ollie's face after Edmund shot that arrow at his father could be seen as clear as any other memory. As he recalled taking that shot, it failed to spawn any kind of regret. He even felt a sense of pride upon seeing his father's startled face when the throne was pierced, inches from his quivering chin. He wondered if one should feel shame for the lust he had for such a sight. Then came the discussion he had with his deck scrubber, Elaine, the girl who had made the night have at least one thing to look back on with regret. A terrible thing. He couldn't muster how it felt to listen to her words. He knew of everything that happened on his ship, and even witnessed it at times. But to hear it described from a voice, the voice of the girl that was broken into pieces because of it, that became the last push to throw him into a rage. He kicked the canopy of his bed and shook the wood. His hatred was divided between a dozen people, but the one he hated most of all was the one that lived beneath his own skin. He himself was a cruel man, and it took the words of a beaten and bruised girl to make him realize that. The sack of gleaming rubies that Queen Miriam had gifted him sat in the corner of his chambers atop his father's old chest. He felt a spite for them for merely existing. He had no use for them, though he had the idea of giving them to each of the girls that were staying in the castle. He knew he'd soon be telling them all to disperse across the sea and leave him to live an unmarried life as a lord with a lover already at his side. A second thought was to offer them to his brother, knowing he might soon take him beyond the shores of their home after he becomes the lord, showing him the world he had been hiding from for so long. Byron would one day hold his own fort, those that stood on the other islands, aging like their keepers as each winter came to pass. His brother may possess Stormwatch on the island of Yarg, or perhaps Skiffold on Gronos. He might become a keeper himself, a man sworn to the Saltspear name with his own duties, whether it be the shipkeeper like Sir Garlin, or the fieldkeeper like his grandfather, Ivan. Byron would climb whatever ranks he faced. He knew his brother well enough to see how bright he truly was, forever with his head buried in his books, learning of the world and its many histories. The thoughts of his brother were cherished as they bloomed, yet soon they came to wilt as the dread of the day flooded his head again. No use came from sulking in his sheets. The day was calling him, though he was reluctant to heed it. He wanted nothing more than to drift back into another sleep and fight his throbbing head, but there were people beyond the door of his chambers that he sought, eager for their wise words. Raffus was his first thought, the man who wielded more wisdom than any archive could manage. Edmund wished to plead with him for guidance, to inquire about what he might do, what he might say when the time came to rid the island of his new visitors. They were his only true friend among the keepers of the islands. Ivan was a wise enough man, though any words the two of them would discuss would immediately be whispered into the ear of Edmund's father. He was also a man incapable of knowing when to stop spewing out his many insights, consistent in his pursuits of sounding both helpful and sharp-witted. Tauren had no interest in any of the duties he held that involved advising his lords, unless, of course, it called for something violent. He was a man built for battle and the planning of war, and there was no man alive who would not fear Tauren in his prime as a young man. As for Garlin, the horrid man would be a waste of breath in Edmund's eyes, one unworthy of offering any counsel. When the day would arrive of Edmund's new position as a lord, he would see to it that Garlin was stripped of any rank or power to his name. It was a pitiful price to pay for all the man had done in the shadows within the shores of Gronos. Edmund knew his own nature. He knew of his own crassness, his crudity and his lack of regards when it came to speaking with those he resented, even if they were the sweetest of girls that had arrived to be courted by him. He would shun them all without mercy. He would send them from his shores with tears on their cheeks and sorrow in their hearts, and he wouldn't lose a second of sleep from it. It was that very reason why he would seek out his more trusted advisers, to remind him that he was surrounded by more than just the suitors and proposals he feared, but by potential allies that his home desperately needed. He knew whatever warmth might be hiding within him would require more than his own hands to fish out, so that he might use it when the time came to rid his island of the filth that swarmed it, all the while sounding tender enough to not anger the fathers and brothers of the eager young ladies. As he emerged into the hallways and staircases of his castle, he could already sense the indiscreet ways he was avoided. Mainly it was the servants, ones who undoubtedly had witnessed or heard of his performance in the great hall. Some of the noble daughters had done the same. Edmund imagined that their fathers may have advised them to keep clear of him, to let him calm down after the troubles they had seen. Edmund could not imagine himself objecting to such an idea. He would welcome the small freedom from their clutches. His own father was certain to summon him soon and give him a torturous lecture. His brother would revert to his chambers once again, staying clear of any conflict that plagued the castle or his family. It pained Edmund to know Byron would think back on such an important night with such discontent. The thought brought back the memory of Bree, how she warned him to cease his incessant drinking. She was always his truest adviser, even without the cloak or the grey hair her uncle carried. As for his cousin, he was no doubt still sleeping off the time he had spent with one of the young women he had met at the gathering. It was always the same with him when he was called across the sea, as if he often grew bored of the girls in Morlan, no matter how full his brothels were. Everyone had surely witnessed or heard of the stunt Edmund pulled the night before, but he felt no shame in it when watching people evade him as if he were a bad smell. All but one.
"Good morning, Lord Edmund,"
a stern voice called him, lifting his view from his shoes up to the face of a young lady. One of the noble daughters, one whose name he could miraculously remember despite the clouded memory he had of the gathering, recalling her being the final girl to be presented to him. Rosalind Mead of the Salt Coast. "Morning, Lady Rosalind," he uttered, before using his hand to shield himself from the morning sun. The two conversed in front of Sias's chambers that were certain to be securely locked whilst he enjoyed the company he kept inside.
"You look as if you haven't slept well, my lord."
Her smile was bland and blunt. He recalled her first arrival from the night. He remembered how her mother was absent from the gathering, and she had only herself to introduce her by her own name. She stood at the same height as him, which was a rarity, at least when he looked at the other visiting girls. The two of them were taller than most of the guests under the castle roof. He slightly enjoyed speaking with a girl who wasn't looking up to him as if they were an infant. He could only dread the idea of seeing Jane Crass standing ahead of him, knowing he'd tower over the small child, resentful of his own shadow swarming her.
"I was told these islands were famous for their endless storms," she said, "though it seems the gods have blessed us this morning. I thought it would be best to not waste these cloudless skies, and that perhaps we might venture down to the sea, have a stroll along the beaches."
Before Edmund could offer an answer, the latch of Sias's chamber was lifted, freeing two half-naked girls that smirked at the two of them, looking strangely proud of themselves. Following closely behind was Edmund's shirtless cousin, draped in sweat and thick muscle that he presented to the hallway as if his body were an enemy's head. "Morning, cousin, and to you, young lady," he spoke, pecking the air between himself and Rosalind, who looked displeased by the man she stared at.
"It's a pleasure to meet you again, my lord,"
she said with a tiny, thoughtless bow. Sias squinted his eyes and looked her over with confusion. "Remind me where we've met again. I've visited my fair share of whorehouses in my life. It's hard to keep track of all the lovely girls I've had for those many nights."
"You think I'm a whore, Lord Sias?"
"Well, you've got a face that's pretty enough. I'm sure you'd walk away with heavy pockets if you came and worked in my brothels in Morlan. I wouldn't waste your efforts on my dear cousin here. He's the dullest salt spear alive. No fun at all. You'd have better luck seducing my decrepit uncle on his deathbed. Or my dear cousin, Byron. He's a man grown by now. Is he not, cousin? About time he got himself a girl to keep him warm at night.
Rosalind forced a smile, standing with her chin high like any noble-born would. You docked at the Salt Coast 2 summers ago. I'm sure you remember the time you cut off the hand of one of the dock workers for stealing your roll of bread. My mother was not very pleased with your visit, I'm afraid. You'd certainly recall my mother, yes? Lady Myra Mead?
Some time had passed until his narrow eyes lit up with realization. Edmund could see his cousin's gaze wavering. How he too wondered how a Mead could look so pleasant, despite the practices of her home and her house.
Of course, Lady Myra's daughter. I'm sorry you had to see that, but the prick deserved it, I can promise you that. Lady Ryan, was it?
Rosalind, Sir Sias, she corrected.
Yes, Lady Ros. Of course I remember you now.
He looked her up and down again, admiring the woman who stood taller than him with a smile on his face, one she mirrored oddly.
Lord Edmund, Rosalind announced. A walk. I thought I'd spare you the task of having to choose which of the girls you started courting first.
Edmund wavered. I apologize, but I have some meetings to attend. I will be sure to call on you when the time is convenient.
Convenient?
Rosalind repeated, widening her green eyes at the word with a subtle strain of bewilderment.
Well, if your archery fails, I'm sure your charm will win over many of those girls, my lord. I look forward to being courted by you. Of course, that is, when it is convenient enough for you to tolerate.
My cousin is a walking wreck when it comes to charm, Ros.
Sias teased as he laughed, nudging Edmund in the shoulder.
I'll bet he's been pissing in his sheets ever since he heard the lot of you girls were crossing the seas. Not as experienced as his cousin, I'm afraid.
There's certainly not many souls who would dispute that, my lord,
Rosalind said softly, smirking at the two of them.
You're rather famous along the coasts and their brothels, Lord Sias, but I have yet to meet a single girl who has a tale to tell about Lord Edmund here.
Sias laughed again, this time joined by Rosalind, who patted Edmund's shoulder jokingly.
I imagine my cousin put all his effort into his bow, and that his skills on the brothels are unworthy of any tales from the whores of the coast.
Again, more chuckles and smirks followed.
Well then, I suppose I will show myself to the Spear Shores, Rosalind announced. I've wanted to see them ever since I was a little girl.
Hardly anything to them anymore, Sias told her as he slipped on a shirt. I'll take you down to them, seeing that my cousin has his important meetings to attend to. Why should a lovely lady travel the beaches alone when my time is free for her?
She nodded slightly.
Very well. Have a pleasant day, Lord Edmund.
He left the presence of both of them, not in pursuit of any meetings or important business, but to see someone he could converse with freely, without any insults, swoons, or tedious lectures. After failing to find Raffus throughout the many halls and rooms of the Flint Fort, he found himself wishing to speak with Ollie down by the docks. He had spent what remained of the morning trying to convince the guards to grant him freedom from the castle, but the only words he got in return were that of his father, how he was certain Edmund would jump straight onto the tide rider and sail away into the open sea, escaping the flood of persistent young ladies. He had considered the passage in his chambers, but his despicable father now had the beaches lined with guards that marched across the sands like fools. They were clearly there to keep people inside instead of out. He was watching them now, staring down firstly at the sands of armoured men, before looking in the distance, to the far docks where his lover would be hard at work on a canvas, one that he was surely drenching in beautiful colours. He had finally caught sight of Raffus, though the man was hundreds of paces away, down on the beaches, enjoying a walk alongside the waves with Bree linked at his arm. She was all the family he had left, his only niece and the last of his blood, a girl he treasured more than any jewel he wore on his fingers or scroll he held in his belts. He envied their freedom from the castle grounds, yearning for the air they breathed. The sky above was remarkably blue once again. It was as if the presence of their new arrivals shooed away the morning storms that Braille was so bitterly known for. The wind remained fierce. It let his clothes flourish in the sweeping breeze that carried the familiar scent of the fish and salt from the sea. The towering wall that surrounded the courtyard and the castle's entrance was what he stood on, neither side of it looking any grander than the other. Every brick of it, corner to corner, was an eyesore to anyone who would care to give them a second look. As the heir to his father's position, Edmund aspired to turn Braille into something more than what it was, somewhere he may actually prefer to be instead of sailing out to the sea around it. His father's sickness just needed to be quicker in its efforts to rid him from the world. He soon found himself walking the castle grounds, watching the servants scurry by him as they continued making the flint fort look more presentable. Some of the noblemen were huddled in groups like sheep, babbling in their croaky voices about their daughters and the journeys they each took to arrive on the island. They were avoided as best as Edmund could, sneaking among the shade of the castle walls that were still being adorned in old salt-spear banners. The cobbles he walked on were once teeming with young lads who used them as training grounds, each of them clanging their wooden swords together while Edmund watched from the battlements. He recalled his cousin in those distant days, how he swept through the boys with ease while mocking their every mistake. Now, the grounds were used for hardly anything. They sat decayed and neglected, unalluring to the eyes of anyone who stepped through them.
"Ah, the Lord is finally awake!"
A husky voice called out from the centre of the withered cobbles. Edmund looked up to see Zorin Kras staring back at him, smiling slightly. The man was sitting in a chair among the daylight, hardly moving as he greeted him, keeping his body and face as still as he could while his portrait was in the works. Ollie's eyes briefly looked his way too. Edmund smiled at the sight, spotting his lover ahead of Lord Zorin with a canvas between them, one he stroked and prodded at with his paint-riddled fingers.
"What are you doing here?"
Edmund asked, hurrying his pace to join them at their side, looking forward at the beginnings of their art piece.
"Ollie here was eager to take on the task of my portrait, my lord,"
Zorin explained, still stiff in his stance.
"I thought we might make the best of this courteous weather we've been blessed with. The flint fort would be a grand backdrop for the painting, wouldn't you agree?"
Edmund looked at the canvas, amused by the few blotches and smears that were roughly shaped like the balding man.
"I'm sure it will, my lord,"
Edmund called over to him, nudging Ollie playfully with his own shoulder. Ollie kept his eyes on his work, piecing together the paint to match the man's spotted skin. "I thought you'd still be sleeping off the rum you had last night," he whispered to Edmund, keeping his voice low among the people that hurried round them. "You still reek of it." "I've been drinking rum since the age of 10, Ollie," Edmund smirked. "I've grown used to the consequences that come with it." "How about the consequence of acting like a complete fool in front of a dozen lords? And what about the consequence of shooting an arrow at your father? You're supposed to be impressing them, not scaring them off." "Well, you've certainly renounced your opinions," Edmund muttered. "I thought you of all people would want these young ladies running back to the western shores." "Once, perhaps. That was until a high-born lord bought 3 of my paintings and asked for a portrait. If this piece impresses him enough, who's to stop him from asking for another? He may even recommend me to the other lords that are present."
"I'll give you all the coins in my pocket when my father is dead,"
Edmund told him with a charming tone. "I'll buy out your entire stall and have you painting a portrait of me each month. And I'll pay you handsomely, of course. And while your father still has breath in his lungs, and while I still must sleep on the docks that stink of fish, I'll take all the work I can get from Braille's new visitors. The fantasy you speak of stands in the future, but as for now, I must tend to the present. Your father's illness could last longer than you hope for. The man could make it through the winter. You cannot know for certain." Edmund sighed. "It won't be much longer, I promise you." As he fought himself against the idea of caressing Ollie's cheek, the sound of bare feet slipping across the stone came, as well as the sickening sounds of clattering chains. The two of them turned to face a young boy, one with no hair on his head, and with fair skin that was smothered in Saskaran markings. His eyes were shallow and grey, sunken into a skeletal body that looked to have been starving for some time. One of the Queen's slaves, quiet and petrified.
"Her Majesty, Queen Miriam, she asks to see you, my lord,"
the shaken boy uttered, looking to his feet as he did. Edmund wavered, sniffing out the accent he had, one bred from the south. "You speak my tongue?" Edmund asked him, crouching slightly to meet his gaze. He thought none of the slaves knew a word of the language. The Queen herself said it to be true.
"The Queen, my lord, she sends for you."
"Are you from the south? What is your name?"
You can follow me to her,"
the boy continued, willingly ignoring his questions.
"She waits for you on the battlements."
Edmund didn't take his eyes off of the boy for some time, watching him longingly with concern and turmoil. "No, I do not wish to speak with Her Majesty today." The slave boy faltered in his expression, almost letting sudden tears swarm his cheeks as his breaths came out heavier. "Please, my lord." Their slim and shirtless bodies shivered, both from the cold winds and the fear he clearly had for his queen. Edmund looked at Ollie, both of them distraught by the withering sight. "What will happen if you go back to her alone?" Edmund asked him. "Edmund, just go with him," Ollie whispered. "Will she punish you?" The slave boy said nothing, yet his eyes spoke 100 timid words as his body began to shiver. "Go," Ollie urged, pushing him forward, letting the shackled boy lead the way to the battlements. Edmund reluctantly followed, sorrowfully watching the boy climb the stone stairs with scrawny legs. He attempted to draw out some truthful words from him as they ascended, yet the child remained as silent as the grave, riddled in unease. "Are you from the Salt Coast?" he asked the Mark child, aching at the sight of the symbols and foreign words smothering their skin. No answer came of it. They soon emerged at the top of the walls that surrounded the castle grounds. The slave boy pointed his finger forward, letting Edmund spot the woman draped in the pink that matched her sails. As he stared forward at her with a burning malice, he turned to see a slender guide running back the way they came on their small legs, leaving him alone with the queen. Her Majesty stood at the edge of the battlements with her gloved hands on the stone. She looked out in silence over the shores of his home with an unimpressed gaze. She no longer wore the excessive headwear from the night before. Instead, her hair came down in black waves to her ribs that were laced in ruby-red jewels that resembled gleaming flowers. A shining tiara stood prominently at the scalp. It too had crimson laces of rubies between the golden tails of scorpions that masked her forehead. As for her dress, it remained the same color as her banners that were carried by the 6 shirtless slaves that waited at her side with bowed heads. Edmund neared closer, watching her as if she were a viper about to spring his way. He moved in silence until the two of them were at each other's side, both staring at the northern storms in the distance that crept across the sea. "If you wish to speak with me, you will come and find me yourself," Edmund told her through tightened lips. "You will not send your slaves to bring me back to you." The queen smirked. "You give me orders as if I am one of your servant girls." Her hand raised, snapping her fingers to lift the heads of her silent slaves, informing each of them to leave their presence. They soon cleared the battlements in a fearful hurry, marching down the stairs with their pink banners still raised. "Your skill with the bow," she spoke with her continuous smile. "Magnificent." Edmund twitched. "You wish to speak about my skill in archery? Is that why you summoned me?" "What would you prefer us to talk about, Lord Edmund?" "I have no desire to converse with the likes of you, Your Majesty," Edmund said coldly. "That boy you sent to find me, he would have been harmed if I refused your calling. Yes, you and your threats have no place here." "I have given no threats, my lord," she said, sounding sweet. "It is my home that is being threatened, and it is only marriage that I have come for." "There will be no talk of marriage. Slave handlers are not welcome within these shores or beyond seas that divide our countries. You may bribe my father as much as you like, but when his death comes and his title falls to me, I'll order any ship in the south bearing your colors to be flared and sent to the ocean floor. You ought to hurry back to your rock while you still can. I imagine my father does not have many breaths left to take." "Now that sounds more like a threat," she smiled. "If you and I will not speak of marriage today, I will ask something else from you. I have wondered, why is it that you hate your father so deeply? I see how your face changes when you look his way. I see the fire in your heart burning brighter." "He's a cunt," Edmund spat impenitently. "Tell me why, Lord Edmund," she dared, still smirking as she always did, speaking in a voice that would sound so pure if it were not for the cruelty she followed. "I am not on your island, Your Majesty. I don't have to confess anything to you. I am not your slave to torment." "No," she said with pursed lips. "You are no slave." Her dark eyes admired him for all that he was. They scattered along his body and face like he were a statue of polished gold that called for her intrigue.
You are my friend.
You have a gift for delusions, I'll grant you that, Edmund mocked. Perhaps the customs in the north are not the same as the south. You see, offering a sack of rubies does not merit a friendship, nor do tales of your hardships back home. The wars you are fighting are not ours to follow, and I'll not send a single one of my men to battle for an island on foreign seas.
I did not come for your island to trade my jewels. They were a gift for you. But I do offer something much greater. I offer you my daughter, my precious daughter, and her hand.
You can keep her. Edmund didn't return her glare. Instead, he continued to watch the distant sea with unmoving eyes.
As I said last night, Lord Graen has 2 sons.
She strode over to the opposite side of the battlements and peered down at the castle grounds between the castle and the wall's grand gate.
Come and see for yourself, Lord Edmund. See how I am prepared for what I must do if you refuse my daughter.
Edmund followed her gaze down to the dead garden that had 2 wandering souls walking among the shrubs and vines, both immersed in a joyful talk as they followed the green path. Byron was smiling in a way he rarely had before. It reflected the one of his fetching companion, who giggled at his words and possessed him with a swooning Felian accent. Princess Shasma was proving to be a girl who was skilled in the arts of enticing men into her clutches, though Byron was always easily led. The queen's daughter was bewitching him with whatever foreign magic she wielded, one taught to her by her own mother, no doubt.
Your brother had not been outside the castle before today,
the queen said softly. Edmund gawked at the sight. How did she do that?
My daughter is beautiful in every way. She has more kindness than most souls. What fool would not follow her into the sun?
Edmund gritted his teeth, meeting her gaze once again that stood only inches from her. Whatever game you've plotted with your daughter, you'll find that my brother will have no part in it. You think he would willingly ask for the hand of a girl that owns beaten slaves? He despises her, I'm sure of it. His formalities are a performance he's been putting on since the moment he took the princess's hand for a dance. He's only doing what our father has asked of him.
A shame. My daughter tells me she enjoys Lord Byron's company very much,
the queen told him, picking at her gloves.
He is kind. He is gentle.
The traits your daughter cannot share. He shot back. This dream of a match between them will not come to light. My brother's innocence will not be smeared by that girl. I will not allow it. He is too scared to speak truthfully about how she makes him feel, but I am an honest man, and I swear to you on his behalf that he will not fall for your tricks, and nor will I.
The honest man is not so honest,
she said. He became irritated and almost amused by her senselessness. My words to you have been truthful. I have spoken of how neither myself or my brother will take part in this alliance you are hoping to see. I have told you of my resentments for your house and for those chains you put on the wrists of the slaves you brought here.
Yes, you speak the truth of it all, but not about the fire within you, the queen went on. Why do you hate your father, Lord Edmund?
She stepped back over to the other side of the wall to see the ocean again, bathing in the subtle warmth of the sunlight that reflected off the water while letting the wind flow through her. What business is it of yours?
The arrow flies, and you pray the man dies, she said softly. Everybody saw. Everybody witnessed the hate you hold for him when you released your arrow. You say you are an honest man, yet you hold the truth in your chest.
If he withheld his reasoning, she would be proven right, taking away his claim as an honest man. The woman was a trickster, almost an admirable one in his eyes, one who had backed him into a corner with her wicked ways. Again, another smirk. Edmund twitched, ready to unleash a flood of reasons onto her about every last problem he has had involving his despicable father, until, holding his tongue as best he could, realizing he couldn't tell her the whole truth of it. I do not wish to marry, but he thinks otherwise, he let out, scolding the mere thought of the wretched man. She narrowed her dark eyes.
Do you think you are the first man who does not want to be forced into a marriage?
I have known many princes your age, and all they wish to do is bed women every night. But when threats of war come to your shores, you will want allies more. Allies like me. I know you are losing your friends to the west. The king and his houses have begun to forget the name of Salt Spear. Your house is sinking to the sea bottom, and you know mine is the one to pull it back into the light. He cast her words aside. They were the words of a malevolent ruler that attempted to sway him like a profane temptress. Nothing more. Queen Miriam seemed to catch his uncertainty. Do you know how old I was when I was married to my own prince? She questioned him. I would not know, your majesty, and do not care to. I have not read up on your house's history, and for good reason, but everyone in the south knows of the cruel traditions of the north, how children are sent into their marriages like lambs to slaughter, he told her. Another smile appeared, looking both amused and saddened by what he had said. I was barely 2 weeks old. Edmund's heart fell into a deep pit he didn't know his body wielded, almost asking her to repeat what she had said to him and confirm its horrid existence. But he had heard it, as sickening as it was. 2 weeks fresh from the womb. A baby that was a bride. The strings of hate and pity pulled at each other in his stomach. You were a baby? He asked softly. Why? Why so young? I was not born in Philia. I came from further east, beyond the Sea of Silk. I was the youngest child of 7 from the island of Unvari. My father is King Loroso. The man who ruled over my beloved Philia at the time was my dear husband's father, King Jorn. He was willing to share his rubies with any island that offered him a daughter for his only son, and an alliance too, of course. The king needed ships more than the jewels in his mountain. He was at war? Edmund asked her, though he kept his composure, attempting to look far less intrigued by her words than he really was. Anyone that sits on Philia's throne is at war, young lord. He was growing desperate. The islands were joining together and preparing their sieges and their armadas. My father had 6 sons, and Jorn had only 1 prince. Neither of them would agree to offer help until the marriage took place. But every enchantress my mother called for had told her she had a girl growing in her belly, a daughter that was the key to my father's proposal. And soon my hand was promised to a stranger before I even knew what a son felt like. A tragic story without a doubt, yet one Edmund tried to not feel any sympathy for. The woman in front of him was still the infamous Queen of Philia, the owner of so many shackled slaves that were forced to heed her every order. She was undeserving of his pity, leaving him to only stare at her blankly, still with scorn in his expression. It does not matter now, she went on. I married the prince. His name was Ahmar, and he gave me the greatest gifts I could have ever hoped for. He gave me my daughters and a home to love. He was a far better king than my own father ever was. He handled the threats in our enemies until they weren't a concern to us, keeping us safe for so many years, letting our children grow up without the fear he had as a young prince. To speak of her late husband urged her hand to her stomach. She took a breath as she recalled him in her mind, holding back the tears she had clearly wanted to set free. Before the sickness took him, he taught me everything I needed to know about ruling the home he had protected. I only wish I could have had the strength he had. I'd never birthed any sons for his throne to fall to, and my daughters were too young to rule themselves, so it came to me. When my eldest daughter, Mariam, had come of age, she was already married to a kind lord in the west. She did not wish to sit on her mother's throne, pledging that she would wait for me to leave this world before she ever returned from her family. And how could I blame her? The Philian throne would break her delicate soul without the allies I searched for. I must protect them, like my good husband protected them, like any mother should. It was the first time Edmund had seen any saddened tone come from Her Majesty. He felt as if he was finally witnessing the walls around her crumble, ones built from her prominence and false dignities that slowly began to tumble, letting him see her as her true self. Failing my island means failing my family, she whispered, keeping her voice low as if the wind might understand her words, spotting her weakness that she kept hidden away. Those that ruled before me had all kept Philia safe from any siege. I refuse to be the first to let it fall. Edmund shook his head. But to marry off your daughters to men you do not know. I am not proud of the things I must do for my home. It aches my heart to send away my children to strange lands across the sea, but I know my daughters better than any other. They are strong, they understand what they must do, and are willing to give their hands to the men I choose, to keep their home and their people safe. And I choose these men well, just as I chose a salt spear for my dear Shasma. Her dark eyes turned to the sea once again, as if the waves were her sanctuary that she needed to escape to when their talk turned too bitter. She was not impressed by how different it was to the island she clearly missed. If you're looking for my compassion, you won't find it here, Edmund spat. Perhaps the fault is entirely my father's. Perhaps he lied to every guest he invited here, telling them I was seeking out a bride to wed. A marriage is his desire, not my own. And what is your desire? She dared, taming her hair that flew around her head in the wind. To live a life with a hand free of any betrothal, he said. To not have the duties that come with a wife, to not father any children. I do not care about the disappointment it will bring to my family name. Their opinions will not matter. Let the ancestors chastise me. Let the children of my house look back at their histories and mock me for it. I will not live to see the day that I might conform to the life my father wishes for me. The Queen nodded slowly, both intrigued and cunning in her gaze. My daughter, she does not wish to have the slaves in her company. Even when she was a child, she would not give orders to them, but instead help them do their chores. She would sneak food from her plate, feeding them in secret out of her father's sight. I want you to know, when Braille becomes her home and she carries the name of Salt Spear, no slaves would follow her. The two of them once again looked down from the wall they stood on, peering over the young pair that strode among the parched gardens, listening to their distant laughter. She seems taken by your brother, she told him with her familiar smirk. I do not need to marry the heir to the Trident Islands for an alliance to be made. A marriage between a salt spear and a core is all that my home requires. From what I've seen, Lord Byron is fond of her too, though you would not believe it. You left the gathering much earlier than the two of them. You were not there to see how they bonded through the hours, how they came closer with every song they had danced to. Your brother may hate the lives me and my daughter have in Philia, but I know young love when I see it. Not one of my daughters has looked at the man in the way Shasma looks at your brother. Your eyes have been false to you, Your Majesty, Edmund told her coldly. As I've already said, my brother has no affection for her. He thought about his brother for a long moment, recalling his face when he danced with Princess Shasma at his gathering. In truth, Edmund had hardly known Byron's true smile. He was unsure if he had ever seen it. Then came the second thought of how his brother had gone beyond the castle walls and out into the withered gardens, how he had stepped out into the open air with a princess at his side, something he had never once done before. Your brother has spoken to you about my daughter, the Queen asked. Edmund slowly shook his head, not taking his eyes off the pair that were promenading along the cobbles. You should talk to him, Her Majesty continued. Let him tell you how he feels. It will not unfold in the way you're hoping for, Edmund told her. I know my brother well enough to know when he has doubts. And if you are wrong, what if he does wish to wed her? She questioned, moving forward with intrigue. Then I will end it. Edmund grew tired of the incessant smirk the Queen always carried, how it mocked him without any noise, how it would not falter as he spewed his hate and his venom. The boy you sent when you summoned me, Edmund went on. He spoke with the tongue of a southern lad, bred near the shores, perhaps from Siren's Bay. You told me none of your slaves knew the language of my country. You told me I should not bother to speak with any of them. Tell me, Your Majesty, what is a boy born 1,000 miles from the island of Philia doing in your company?
Her smirk crippled, wavering to his words before it returned to its rightful self.
Every slave has their stories. Some come from the sea cities of Saskara, others come from the valleys and coasts of the south. The handlers in Kirmir find them where they can. I do not ask questions about the past of the slaves that I buy.
Edmund took a step forward, brewing the slanders behind his lips before the clanging of a bell filled the air.
"Open the gates!"
A gravelly voice called out, turning Edmund's head to face the great wooden entrance to the castle grounds. He moved along the battlements to catch sight of the men that heaved at the chains, pulling open the large gates to allow a single white horse to enter. A horse in Braille? The sight was a strange one, for no soldier or guard would ride them on an island that was small enough to travel around entirely before dusk. Yet a white stallion gleamed in the centre of the cobbles, with a rider that gloated on its back before hopping off. The rider wore silver armour, reflecting the light of the sun into Edmund's squinted eyes. They wore no helmet, letting their long locks of blonde hair fall to their shoulders as they pulled it back, stroking their fingers through it like golden thread. It was Cassian Tuck, a man who had mastered the art of boasting and arriving unannounced. He was the only son of Sir Ivan, though Cassian was far less tedious in his words as his grizzled father. The island of Gravis would soon fall under his watch upon Ivan's demise. Edmund imagined it would follow soon after his father's. The two old men would greet the dirt together. To Edmund, the man was a prick he hardly knew, but to Byron, he was his only uncle. The family of his father's first wife, Edmund's mother, were all dead, and had been for over a decade. Their bodies were buried on the island of Yark beneath a sacred structure Torin had ordered to be built after the war, one Edmund would rarely visit, always hesitant to pay his respects to the infamous House of Stout. Other than Byron, all that remained of Grian's second wife's family was her father and brother, both of whom had missed their dearly deceased Helene. Edmund still recalled her death. He remembered the swellings of crimson and purple sprawled across her body before it seized her throat enough to choke her in her sleep. It was a sight for his nightmares, but he had seen much worse on the seas. He recalled his own father's tears, how the man cried like an infant for days as the body rotted in their chambers. Ollie paused his painting, turning to the brawn man, staring at him alongside Lord Zorin. Edmund watched on as Byron walked out onto the grounds with Princess Shasma at his side. He greeted his uncle and watched as Cassian bowed his head to the girl draped in pink silks, flicking his long hair from his face before kissing her hand full of scarlet rings. The three of them shared a laugh before Byron led him inside. Edmund stared down the back of his golden head with tight lips, muttering curses beneath his breath before marching away from the wall's edge.
"Another guest?"
the Queen announced as she approached his side once again. Edmund sighed. "Yes, another cunt. One I'm not happy to see." Her Majesty chuckled at his words.
"You have too much hatred in your heart, young lord."
"I do my best to use it sparingly, though these last few days have been eager to draw it out." She didn't know the extent of his endless loathing for those around him. He wondered if she even truly knew how much he resented her. The Queen seemed to be shielded from any insults Edmund had thrown her way, as well as the obvious ways he had made it clear he did not enjoy her company. "I have things that I must tend to, Your Majesty," he lied, only wishing to be away from her presence. "We will speak no further about these plans you have for my brother and your daughter. They will not happen, that I promise you."
"I will believe you when your brother says it from his own lips," she said, smiling cunningly. "If he does not love her, if he does not wish to take her hand in marriage, I will take my daughter and return to Philia. I will not ask you for your men, I will not ask you for your ships. I will leave your island and never dock on your shores again, my lord."
Edmund scoffed, mocking how naive the Queen was. "Prepare your sails, Your Majesty."